question isn't whether Donald Trump lost the election. The question is whether a victory is legitimate under constitutional supremacy. Note, I understand that there are some allegations of discrepancies and the counting. However, I myself, as a creator, do not put weight on that because there's not enough information to actually dictate a conclusion. See, the difference between the delusional MAGA is that they position that the election was stolen when there was not significant evidence that it was. Currently, there is investigations. However, we don't have information to say whether it was or wasn't. Even if it is possible that there is some evidence of some discrepancies, the question is it significant? So I'm not putting weight on this itself, but rather the legitimacy of any victory. Because if Article 6 of the United States Constitution tells us anything, it is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. This means that you are incapable of challenging the Constitution unless we actually amend it. In this reality, the constitutional supremacy is capable of overruling democracy because democracy is only possible derived from the United States Constitution. Once this legitimacy dissolves, then all of that is meaningless. And we know this per Federalist 78 through 83 of the Federalist Papers. Now, what is known per the January 6th report, which has its authority derived from Article 1 of the United States Constitution, is that the certification happened on January 7, 2021, a day too late, a day past the deadline of January 6, 2021. This means that as the commander-in-chief, Donald Trump failed at the bare minimum level to use his resources as president and commander-in-chief to actually quell the chaos that resulted in the delay. Then there is evidence that this was willful, that this was intentional. And this is all full of that evidence and laws that were broken under his guidance. This means that former President Donald Trump failed to do his basic duty of adhering to his oath to the Constitution under Article 2. Before he enters on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath of affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Did he do that on January 6th? No, he did not. Had the certification happened on January 6th, I wouldn't have any weight, but it happened on January 7th. This means that he failed. This means that there is a remedy required, and in the courts delaying this case, it means that there is legitimacy questions to his victory. So the question isn't whether he won the election, but whether it's legitimate. Because in making him the president without any remedy as to whether or not he actually contributed or comforted in an insurrection per Amendment 14, Section 3, the disqualification clause, where no one who has taken an oath to protect and uphold the United States Constitution shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. At the bare minimum, former President Donald Trump comforted in the insurrection. Now, there are three possibilities as to how our Amendment 14, Section 3 can be executed. One is through the courts, the case which was delayed, of course, which means that the courts failed to actually satisfy their duty to uphold the United States Constitution. But also Article 1 of the Constitution also provides Congress with the capability to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union and suppress insurrections. They failed to do that, which means that another branch failed to uphold the social contract. And of course, the executive also fell on that day. That means all three branches failed. How do we know this? Federalist 9, written by Alexander Hamilton. The Union as a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection. A firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. Did former President Donald Trump quell an insurrection? No. So this means that we are not a great union because of former President Donald Trump. He failed to uphold his part of the social contract as the executive and commander-in-chief and president. This is a direct violation of Article 1 of the oath and of Article 6 supremacy clause. Because above democracy, above the public opinion, above the executive, above the judiciary, above the legislative is the people per the Constitution. Federalist 78, written by Alexander Hamilton, where the will of the legislator, which is Congress, declared in its law stands in opposition to that of the people declared in the Constitution, the judges ought to be governed by the latter rather than the former. They ought to regulate their decisions by the fundamental laws rather than by those not fundamental. Federalist 81, admit that the Constitution ought to be the standard of construction for the laws, and that wherever there is an evident opposition, the laws ought to give place to the Constitution. See, the worst thing that can happen, even if there is evidence of fraud, is that the courts will not want to take it seriously and will just say, hey, it's already done, we're not going to do anything about it. It's also questionable whether the disqualification case will go anywhere, because obviously if he's president, it really beats the point. And as reality, it means that the courts failed its basic duty to uphold constitutionality above anything else. Upon wrongful judicial decision from the constitutional courts, its legitimacy, therefore authority over the states, dissolves. To say this is untrue is to say the courts do not derive its power from constitutional supremacy and authority. So if it dissolves because we replace constitutional authority with Trump supremacy, it means that it is no longer binding to the state government. A failure of the Supreme Court to expedite judicial decision on insurrection before January 20 deadline is to, through inaction or complacency, sacrifice constitutional supremacy for Trump supremacy. And the fascinating thing about this, the fascinating thing that I'm excited for, is that in these realities, and either realities where they're incapable of actually finding a solution to the question of whether there are legitimacy questions because of the insurrection, this means that the legitimacy of the court falls apart. Why? All Article 3 of the Constitution tells us is that the Supreme Court justices are there for good behavior. What does that mean? Federalist 83, the true test of a just application of them is its conformity to the source from which they are derived. The reality is that our constitutional provisions does not allow to put forward the public opinion or even democracy above constitutional supremacy, and that's what Article 6 is for, which means that the court should uphold constitutionality, not democracy or political processes that are not derived from constitutional power. Federalist 78, through the medium of the courts of justice, whose duty it must be to declare all acts contrary to the manifest voice of the Constitution void. Without this, all the reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. Now, upon a Trump presidency and inauguration, this means that upon the overextension of his power over the states, for instance, mass deportation and tries to force California to adhere to it, California has the authority to reject the legitimacy and authority of the federal government because of this, because there was no remedy. Federalist 78, until the people have by some authoritative act, that's Article 5, annulled or changed the established form, it is binding upon themselves collectively as well as individually, and no presumption or even knowledge of their sentiments can warrant their representatives in a departure from it prior to such act. Why would your vote be overturned? Because if you voted for Donald Trump, then you failed your basic responsibility as a U.S. citizen. You failed to uphold the United States Constitution. You failed to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Per the United States Citizens Almanac, the Constitution establishes the U.S. system of representative democracy and outlines the inherent principles of freedom, liberty, and opportunity to which all citizens are entitled. The continuity of the nation's unique freedoms depends on the support of its citizens. When the Constitution and its ideals are challenged, citizens must defend these principles against all adversaries. If you voted for Donald Trump, you did not vote for the Constitution. You voted for your own self-interest. You voted to replace constitutional supremacy for Trump supremacy. This is when courts should be capable of overriding your vote for constitutional authority to restore constitutional legitimacy. If it fails to do this, the exciting thing is that this serves as ultimate evidence that our courts are misaligned to their original intentions. Federalist 78. That inflexible and uniform adherence to the rights of the Constitution and of individuals which we perceive to be indispensable and the courts of justice can certainly not be expected from judges who hold their office by a temporary commission. The only reason they have life terms is because they're expected to be independent in alignment with constitutional supremacy. Upon the reality that they do not resolve this legitimacy question, it means that we're capable of reforming the judiciary without the constitutional processes of the congressional action in order to restore the Constitution. This also means we can impeach those who decide against constitutional supremacy, because it means the judiciary project failed. It's not whether he lost, it's whether it's legitimate.